The telegram arrived in Edinburgh on a Tuesday morning in November 1923, and the man who received it sat down on the floor of his office and wept for 40 minutes. Not because of grief, because of joy. The message had come from a village in the Scottish Highlands no one had ever heard of. A place called Strathkinell, wedged between two mountains and a river that froze every winter. The telegram said only this: "Revival has come. Entire village. Come and see." The man who sent it was not a minister. He was not a theologian. He had never attended seminary, never stood in a pulpit, never once been considered the kind of person God might use for anything significant. His name was Iain MacPherson, and he had been, until very recently, considered the most difficult man in the county of Sutherland. This is his story. And this is what nobody tells you about it. Behind the revival that swept through the Scottish Highlands in the winter of 1923, behind the documented healings, the spontaneous confessions in the street, the church that had been locked for 11 years suddenly flung open and overflowing, was a man who had spent years in complete obscurity, a man who prayed in a barn, a man who had been turned away from his own community's door, a man who had lost everything twice before God entrusted him with anything. This is not just a story about revival. This is a story about what it costs to become the kind of person through whom heaven moves. If you want to understand what that costs, stay with us. Iain MacPherson was born in the autumn of 1879 in the village of Strathkinell, Sutherland, in the far north of Scotland, a place so remote that the nearest railway station was 12 miles away, and most families still heated their homes with peat cut from the moorland in summer and stacked outside the door. His father was a crofter, which meant he worked a small parcel of rented land for barely enough to feed the family through winter. His mother was the daughter of a fisherman from the coast. They were not poor by the measures of their community. They were simply ordinary, the kind of people history does not notice and newspapers do not mention. Iain was the third of 5 children. He was, by his own later account, not a particularly serious child. He ran the hills. He threw stones at the river. He was scolded regularly by the schoolmaster for inattention. What marked him, even as a boy, was something harder to name. An internal restlessness. A sense, never quite articulated, that the world was larger than Strathkinell, that there was something more, somewhere, if only he could find it. He found it, at age 16, in the worst possible way. The summer of 1895 brought a diphtheria outbreak to the Highlands. It moved through villages without mercy. In Strathkinell, it took his younger sister Mary in August, his brother Donald in September. His mother spent 3 weeks in bed, fighting the same infection and recovered, barely, with a cough that never fully left her after that. Iain himself contracted the illness in October. He lay in the back room of the croft for 6 weeks, in and out of fever, close enough to death that his father sent for the minister from the nearest town. The minister came, he prayed. And in that back room, between 2 mountains and a frozen river, something happened to Iain MacPherson that he would spend the rest of his life trying to put into words. He later described it this way: "It was as though the room filled with something I could not see. Not warm exactly, more like weight, a heaviness that was not frightening. I knew without being told that I was known, completely known, and completely held." He recovered. It took, until December, he came out of that room different. Quieter, slower, as though something inside had been rearranged. He told no one what had happened, not his parents, not the minister. He simply went back to working the land with his father, and he began quietly to pray. Not the memorized prayers of Sunday morning, something else. Long, unscripted conversations in the early hours before anyone else woke. Sitting by the fire with a single candle, asking questions, listening for answers. This was the beginning of a discipline no one around him knew existed. And it would be 20 years before anyone noticed what it was producing. By 1901, Iain was 22 years old and restless in a new way. Strathkinell felt smaller than ever. He had read everything the village school library held. He had begun borrowing books from the minister's shelf, theology, history, biography. He had read about D.L. Moody's campaigns in Scotland. He had read about the Welsh revival of 1859. He had read about the prayer meetings in New York in 1857 that had begun with 6 men in a church basement and grown, within months, to tens of thousands gathering across the city every noon hour. Something in those accounts lit a fire in him that he did not know what to do with. In the winter of 1902, a missionary from Edinburgh came through Strathkinell on his way north. He stayed 2 nights at the manse. On the second evening, there was a small gathering, maybe 15 people. The missionary spoke about his work. When it was over, Iain approached him. They spoke for 2 hours. Iain told him about the room in 1895, about the weight, about the knowing. The missionary listened. Then he said something and never forgot. What you are describing is the beginning. But the beginning is not the end. There is a deeper place to go. Most men find the door and stop there. They spend their lives admiring the door. He gave Iain a name, John Hyde, an American missionary in India, known across the evangelical world simply as Praying Hyde, who had spent so many hours in prayer that fellow missionaries reported not being able to enter his room without feeling the presence of God before they opened the door. A man who prayed for specific souls by name for months before they came to faith. A man who had asked God for 1 soul a day and received it, and then asked for 2, and received that. Iain went home and began reading everything he could find about Hyde. What struck him was not the dramatic results, it was the method, or rather the absence of method. Hyde had no system, no program. He simply stayed in the presence of God until something happened. He treated prayer not as a request system but as an environment, a place to live, not a task to complete. Iain read that and felt something shift in him, like a key turning in a lock. He began to pray differently, longer, more specifically. He began keeping a small journal, not of his thoughts, but of names, people he felt prompted to pray for. He would write a name and pray for that person every day for weeks, sometimes months, with no visible result, with no way of knowing if anything was happening at all. This practice would continue for the next 20 years, and for most of those years, Iain MacPherson would look, to every person who knew him, like a man who was quietly and completely failing at life. He never married. He had come close. Once, in 1908, a woman named Fiona from a village further north. But her family had concerns. Iain had no stable income. He had worked the croft with his father but had no plans to expand, no ambitions that made sense to people around him. He had turned down 2 opportunities to move to Glasgow for better work. He seemed to Fiona's father like a man with no direction. Fiona herself was uncertain. She liked Iain. She respected something in him she couldn't name. But the concerns were practical, and Iain could not argue with them. He had nothing to offer except himself, and he had already given himself, in the most complete sense he understood, to God. The relationship ended quietly. Iain grieved it privately, without bitterness, and continued. His father died in 1911. His mother moved to live with his eldest sister's family in Inverness. Iain stayed in Strathkinell, alone, working the croft, attending the local church. Then, in 1912, the trouble began. The minister of Strathkinell Free Church was a man named Hector Gillies, well-educated, well-intentioned, deeply committed to order and propriety. He and Iain had always maintained a polite distance. But in 1912, Iain began to feel something he could only describe as a burden. A weight. Specifically over Strathkinell, specifically over the church. He would wake at 3 in the morning and feel it, a heaviness, a grief that was not his own. He would go to the barn. He kept the barn for the croft's 2 remaining sheep. And he would pray, for hours, sometimes until dawn, for the village, for the people he knew by name, for the church, for something he could not name, asking God for something he did not know how to articulate. He did not tell anyone he was doing this, but after 3 months, he went to Reverend Gillies and asked if there might be a prayer meeting, a regular gathering, midweek, just to seek God together. Gillies was not unfriendly about it. He simply did not see the need. The church had its programs. The Sunday services were attended adequately. There was no crisis. Prayer meetings were for crisis. Iain thanked him and returned to the barn. He went back to Gillies 6 months later with the same request. Same response. He went back a 3rd time in 1913. This time Gillies was less patient. He suggested, with gentle firmness, that Iain's spiritual intensity was perhaps becoming excessive, that there was value in moderation, that obsession with private prayer could become its own form of pride. Iain left the minister's house and walked home through the rain, and he did something that would define the next decade of his life. He did not leave the church. He did not start his own meeting. He did not argue or campaign or recruit sympathizers. He simply returned to the barn, and he prayed harder. This is the pattern no one sees. This is the price no one wants to pay. Humility, in its deepest form, is not just accepting rejection quietly. It is continuing to serve, continuing to believe, continuing to pray, in total obscurity, with no external validation, with nothing to show for it, year after year, through silence that feels like abandonment. Iain MacPherson paid this price for 10 years. And during those 10 years, to every human eye, nothing happened. The war took 3 young men from Strathkinell. 3 more came back changed in ways their families could not reach. The village fell quieter. The church attendance dropped. By 1918, Reverend Gillies was officiating at services where the pews were less than half full, and his sermons had taken on a tone of quiet resignation. Competent, careful, but evacuated of any expectation that God might do anything beyond the routine. Iain kept working the croft. He kept praying in the barn. He kept his journal of names. In the winter of 1919, a name came to him that surprised him. He didn't know where it came from. He woke one morning and the name was simply there, with the same urgency the prompting had always carried. The name was James Tormod. James Tormod was a man who had returned from the war in 1917 and had not spoken voluntarily to anyone in the village since. He lived alone in a cottage near the river. He was, by general consensus, unreachable. Iain began praying for James Tormod. He prayed for him every day for 4 months. Then, on a Thursday evening in March 1920, Iain went to James Tormod's cottage and knocked on the door. James opened it. He looked at Iain with the flat, exhausted eyes of a man who had been waiting for something. Though he could not have said what, Iain said, "I've been praying for you every day since November. I don't know why. I just wanted you to know." Then he left. He did not wait for a response. He walked home through the snow. 3 days later, James Tormod appeared at Iain's door. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then said, "I need to talk to someone." They talked for 6 hours. James Tormod, who had not spoken of France to anyone, talked about France, about the things he had seen, about the things he had done, about the dream that came every night, about the feeling that God, if there was a God, had turned his face away from what happened in those fields. And Iain sat with him, and he did not offer easy answers. He had been in the barn with God long enough to know that easy answers were a kind of abandonment disguised as comfort. He simply said, "I do not know why God allowed those fields, but I know the room I lay in when I was 16. I know what filled that room, and what I felt there was not a God who turns away. It was a God who holds." James Tormod stayed for supper. He came back the following week. He came back the week after. By May, he was attending church for the first time in 3 years. Iain said nothing about this to anyone. He simply wrote in his journal, James T., May 1920, and he moved to the next name. What happened next did not happen quickly. This is important to say, because the accounts that circulate tend to compress the timeline, and the compression does a disservice to the truth. The truth is that between 1920 and 1923, Iain MacPherson quietly and consistently prayed for the people of Strathkinell. He visited the lonely. He sat with the grieving. He never preached. He never organized a meeting. He never presented himself as anything other than a crofter who prayed. But something was accumulating. In the spring of 1921, a woman named Janet Ross, widow, mid-50s, known for her formidable self-sufficiency, came to Iain after a Sunday service. She said she did not know how to explain what she was about to say. She said that 3 weeks earlier, during the night, she had felt something she could only describe as a presence in her room, and she had been unable to stop crying since. Not from sadness, but from something that felt like being washed. She said, "I've attended this church for 30 years. I have never felt anything before. What is happening?" Iain listened. He recognized it immediately. He told her about the room in 1895. By the autumn of 1921, there were 6 people in Strathkinell who had had similar experiences. None of them knew about the others. Iain knew about all of them, because each one had come to him separately, looking confused and undone, and quietly, privately alight. In November 1921, Iain asked Reverend Gillies once more about a prayer meeting. Gillies, for reasons he later said he could not fully explain, said yes. The first gathering drew 9 people. By the following March, it was drawing 47. By the winter of 1922, something was happening in Strathkinell that no one had a framework to describe. The church that had been half empty for a decade was full. Then it was overflowing, people standing in the doorway and outside the windows in the November cold. The services were not unusual in format. Reverend Gillies was still preaching his careful, orderly sermons. But something in the atmosphere of the room had changed. People would begin weeping during the singing of a psalm without knowing why. Men who had not spoken to each other in years would find themselves embracing outside the door after a service. A woman who had harbored an accusation against a neighbor for 12 years appeared at that neighbor's house one Sunday afternoon and sat on the step and wept until the neighbor came out and they reconciled. No one was orchestrating this. No visitor had come. No campaign had been organized. The only thing that had changed was that for the past 3 years, in a barn near the edge of the village, a man had been praying. Then came the cold night in January 1923 that people in Strathkinell would speak of for the rest of their lives. The Wednesday prayer meeting had been running for 14 months. It met in the church hall. On this particular Wednesday, around 30 people were gathered. The meeting had been going for perhaps an hour, following its usual form: a scripture read, a hymn sung, a period of open prayer. Then something shifted. Later, those who were present would struggle to describe it. The best account came from a farmer named Roderick Munro, a taciturn man not given to exaggeration, who said, "The air in the room changed. I cannot explain it differently. It was like the moment before thunder, a gathering, a wait." Then a woman on the other side of the room began to weep. Then another. Then a man who had not prayed out loud in his life stood up and began to confess. And after that, no one was directing anything. The meeting that had begun at 7 in the evening was still going at 2 in the morning. By the following Sunday, word had reached surrounding villages. People were walking hours through the winter to attend. By February, ministers from as far as Inverness had begun making inquiries. The Edinburgh Missionary, the same one who had passed through Strathkinell 21 years earlier, received a letter from Reverend Gillies describing what was happening. He arrived in March. He spent a week. He sent a telegram to colleagues in Edinburgh. The telegram said only, "Revival has come, entire village. Come and see." And someone, somewhere, sat down on the floor of an office and wept for 40 minutes. Iain MacPherson did not preach during the revival. He did not lead the meetings. He continued to attend, to pray, to sit with individuals who sought him out, and they came in increasing numbers, from further and further away. He had by this point a journal containing thousands of names, 20 years of names. He told no one about the journal. Visitors who came to Strathkinell wanting to understand the revival would ask the same question: what started it? What did you do? The villagers would look at each other. Then eventually they would mention Iain, and Iain, when pressed, would say the same thing every time: "I didn't start anything. I just stayed in the room with God until something happened." What the historians who later wrote about the Strathkinell revival could not fully account for was the speed with which it spread. Within 18 months of the January 1923 meeting, documented accounts of revival meetings with similar characteristics had been reported in 7 other Highland villages, in 2 communities in the Outer Hebrides, and in a congregation in Toronto, Canada, where a young Scottish minister had returned from visiting Strathkinell with something he described as fire in his bones. The seed planted in one barn in Sutherland had crossed an ocean. This is the economy of God. You cannot measure his arithmetic by ordinary means. A man prays alone for 20 years and the mathematics do not add up, until suddenly they do. Until the numbers in one generation are beyond counting. One man who paid the price of obscurity quietly set fire to a generation. There were betrayals, there always are. In 1924, as the revival's reputation grew, a man came from Edinburgh, a journalist, not unfriendly, but determined to explain the Strathkinell phenomenon in naturalistic terms. His article, published in a respected Scottish newspaper, described the revival as a case of mass emotional contagion. He quoted extensively from sources who remained anonymous. He suggested that Reverend Gillies had manufactured the atmosphere deliberately for reasons of attendance. He did not mention Iain at all. Gillies was hurt. The congregation was angry. Several members wanted to respond publicly, to correct the record. Iain said, "Let it alone." Then came something that cut closer. A minister from Inverness, A man who had visited Strathkinell and been genuinely moved, began holding his own meetings, modeled on what he had seen. He wrote extensively about the revival and became, within the wider Scottish Church, the recognized expert on what had happened. He spoke at conferences. He wrote a pamphlet. He was interviewed by Christian periodicals. In all of it, he described the revival as having no human origin, that it had simply fallen from God without any specific instrument. He knew about Iain. He had met Iain. He had sat in the church hall and listened to the same people Iain had prayed for by name for years describe what had happened to them, and he wrote Iain out of the story entirely, not maliciously, simply because Iain did not fit the narrative the minister was constructing, because a solitary crofter praying in a barn for 20 years was harder to explain than a sovereign act of God with no human context. When word reached Strathkinell of what the minister was writing, some of those who knew Iain expected him to be wounded, to object, to at least mention privately the injustice of it. He did not. He was asked about it once, directly. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "If God is getting the credit has gone to the right place." And he returned to the barn. This is a different kind of price from humiliation. Humiliation asks you to endure being overlooked. This price asks you to actively release the story, to be willing not just to be unknown but to allow someone else to tell the story incorrectly, and to hold your peace. Most men cannot pay this price. Most men, at the point of erasure, reach for at least a private vindication. A letter, a conversation, a quiet correction. Iain MacPherson paid it fully and said nothing. By 1928, the Strathkinell revival had become a chapter in church history. The visible momentum had passed, as it always does. The meetings returned to a normal size. The extraordinary reports slowed. Life in the village settled back into its rhythms. But something had been permanently changed. Not just in Strathkinell. In the 7 Highland villages. In the Hebridean congregations. In Toronto, where the minister, who had crossed the ocean, was by now leading a congregation that prayed every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., in a tradition he had begun because he had seen it in a barn in Sutherland, and he could not forget it. Iain MacPherson continued his life in complete simplicity. He worked the croft until arthritis made it difficult, then sold the land and lived quietly in the village on very little. He continued attending church. He continued his journal. He continued praying. He was not, by this point, an unknown figure. People came to see him. He received letters. He answered them with characteristic brevity. Courteous, warm, but always turning attention away from himself. When a young man came from Glasgow in 1930 asking Iain to tell him the secret of revival, Iain sat him down, made him tea and said, "There is no secret. There is only whether you are willing to pay the price." The young man asked, "What price?" Iain thought for a moment. The price of the barn. Being willing to pray when nothing is happening, for as long as nothing happens until something does. The price of the journal. Praying for people by name when you have no evidence it is doing anything at all. The price of the locked door. Going back when you have been turned away. And the price of the stolen story. Releasing your name from the account entirely and trusting God to write his own record. The young man wrote it down. He carried it back to Glasgow. What he did with it, only God knows. Iain Alasdair MacPherson died on the 4th of March, 1934, in his home in Strathkinell, at the age of 54. He died of complications from influenza. He had no family with him at the end, no wife, no children, though 2 women from the church were present, and Reverend Gillies came and read the 23rd Psalm. His death was noted in a small announcement in the local paper. A handful of letters arrived at the manse from those who had known him or known of him. There was no formal obituary in the Edinburgh papers. No pamphlet was written about him. No conference was held in his memory. He left behind a croft's worth of tools, a worn Bible, and 31 journals. The journals contained 34 years of names, thousands of them. Names from Strathkinell, from surrounding villages, from letters people had sent him over the years asking him to pray. Beside many of the names were small notes, a date, a few words. Came to faith, March 1920. Reconciled with brother, August 1921, healed, February 1923, and beside many other names, nothing, only the name written over and over across years of pages. Reverend Gillies kept the journals. He did not know what else to do with them. He placed them in a box in the vestry and left them there. They were discovered in 1961 by a seminary student doing research in the Highlands. He wrote his thesis on them. The thesis was published, years later, as a small book. The book found its way to Toronto. The minister there, by then in his 70s, long retired, read it through the night. He called his son in the morning, voice breaking, and said, he prayed for this city by name before anyone here knew his name. He prayed for Toronto in 1919, and I arrived here in 1923. There are kinds of faithfulness that will not be seen in a single lifetime. There are prayers that travel across oceans before they land. There are seeds that go into the ground and require a generation before anyone sees what they were. Iain MacPherson never saw Toronto. He never knew his intercession had crossed the water. He died in the village where he was born, believing, to the end, that he had simply done what any man does when he has given himself to God. He had shown up every morning, regardless of whether anything was happening. The question his life poses is not whether God can move through ordinary people in ordinary places. That is no longer a question if you have been paying attention. The question is whether you are willing to pray before you see anything. Whether you are willing to pay the price of the barn, of years without result, without recognition, without anyone watching. Whether you are willing to write names in a journal when you have no evidence the writing is doing anything at all. The question is not whether heaven moves. The question is whether you will be the kind of person through whom it does. Comment below. I am willing to pay the price. If this story has stirred something in you, if you are ready to make room in your daily life for the kind of prayer Iain MacPherson practiced, set aside 20 minutes this week. No agenda, no list of requests, simply be present and see what begins. And if you want to know the story of the woman in the Outer Hebrides, whose prayer life began 3 years before Iain's, and whose intercession for the Highlands predates everything recorded about this era, that story is next.